as well, so I just want to share that. It should be starting to record any second. Okay, so share screen. That's not what I want to share. That wasn't right. 1 second. There we go. Well, I should have set this up a little bit beforehand, but I was in a meeting, so no bigs. Okay, so I can only hope that y'all can see my screen. I unfortunately don't have access to like the chat right now. Yeah, so that's just kind of, that is what it is, and that is fine. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. I was just looking to make sure that the live worked. Okay, so we are on Facebook Live and on Zoom. So as I mentioned before, my name is Casey Wofford. I am doing the How to Be a Decent Human Being series. Today's topic being anti-racist basics. I like to always start out with just the reason why I'm doing this series. So I think a lot of times being in anti-violence work and that being really kind of my focus, oftentimes when I'm having conversations with coworkers, mentors, anyone else who's in the movement as well, you know, we're often flooded with these news stories of violence towards marginalized communities, violence towards others, and it's so devastating to see so many of these news series and these news stories. And oftentimes what I find coming up in conversation is like, why can't people just be decent human beings? Like, come on, it doesn't seem like it should be that hard, but apparently it is. And so I decided to call this How to Be a Decent Human Being series. And today I'm going to be talking about why is it important again to talk about racism and sexism together. Racial violence and sexual violence go hand in hand. And I did want to start off by sharing this quote from Nelson Mandela, who absolutely is a very inspiring individual, has a very inspiring legacy. In this quote, no one is born hating another person based on their color, based on their background, their religion. People must learn to hate. And if they can learn to hate, they can be taught to love, for love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite. And I just love this quote because really, like, when we are born, it's not like we're born with inherent biases towards another group, another population, but from such an early age, we start to get messages about race, about gender, sex, biological sex, you know, just what a man should be, what a woman should be, speaking very binary because those are where the messages are directed. And nobody is taught just flat out like you should hate this certain group of people, but we are given so many messages, and so sometimes hate becomes embedded in us and we are not even aware of it. And so I think it's just really important to recognize wherever you are on your journey within the anti-violence movement, if you start to realize, like even throughout this presentation, certain forms of racism are embedded within you, I want you to know that that's not uncommon. That is the norm, right? Racism is what we live and breathe every single day, same as sexism. But if we can start to begin to be aware that we have racism and sexism embedded within us, then we can start to unlearn these things, and we can really work towards a community that is nonviolent, that is full of love towards ourselves and towards others. And just I like to give a little bit about me. So I use she, her pronouns. I am a white, cisgender, heterosexual woman. And I share that because I think it's important to share what lens I'm speaking from. Even when it came to thinking about giving this presentation, I think for myself, there is a fear there of, should I be the one to be speaking about anti-racism? And the answer is yes, absolutely. We all have a place in this movement, and especially being a white woman, I want to use my race as a way to be able to bring awareness to other white colleagues, other white students, and everything, that it's okay to have these conversations, and acknowledge that white supremacy really is so deeply embedded in the history of the United States. But that being said, I also want to realize like what my limitations are, speaking from my lens, and that I have, it's really important to me that I'm being held accountable by my mentors, by people who I know really care about me, but they're still going to hold me accountable because they also care that I'm continuing to develop in my path towards anti-racism as well. I am the confidential advocate with RBSP, which I'll talk more about. And I like to share that I'm still relatively formally new to the movement to end sexual violence. I started out as a volunteer at a rape crisis center on the hotline and providing accompaniment to forensic exams for survivors. And then I help facilitate trainings for new advocates. That being said, being still, pretty fresh to this field, I think it's important to acknowledge that there are so many women, specifically women of color, who have come before me and laid down the groundwork for the anti-rape movement. And I'm just so thankful for all the people who have used their voices to advocate for the rights of others, to advocate for marginalized communities. And I'll be speaking to that more today. And I do like to share that I completely just like love to identify with the term bad advocate, which I kind of came up with based off of Roxane Gay's series of feminist essays from her book that's called Bad Feminist. When I embrace the term for myself, bad advocate, it's a way to embrace for me knowing that I'm going to constantly be on a journey towards learning anti-racism. I'm going to constantly be on a journey towards making sure that what I'm doing does not perpetuate systems of oppression, and I can be, embrace humility in knowing that, yes, at times I'm always part of that system too, because that's just the United States. That's the system I'm part of. And when I acknowledge that and critically think about it, it's okay to acknowledge, like, even though I'm doing all the work that's possible, I'm still part of the system. I'm still able to perpetuate cultures of violence too. And the more I acknowledge that, the more that I can also work against that. And so going ahead and diving right in, today's objectives, I'm definitely going to cover RBSP services. I want y'all to understand why, again, RBSP is providing a presentation about anti-racism, because sometimes I think people are like, wait, you should be focusing on sexual violence. It's like they're so connected. You can't focus on sexual violence and not focus on other forms. I'm going to be speaking about the history of the intersection of racism and the sexual violence movement, definitely define racism so that we're all on the same page, and discuss some basic forms of behaviors or language that perpetuates racism. And then at the end, of course, it's so important to continue to do your own work for anti-racism. I hope that in the spring to continue this series and continue having sessions to talk about anti-racism, because today is going to be like a 101. So I don't want anyone to watch this and think, oh yeah, like I'm going to learn how to be anti-racist and that's it. No, absolutely not. We're not solving racism today. We're just going over the basics. And so I'm definitely going to be providing resources at the end for you to look into if you're interested. So for RBSP, the pillars of RBSP are education, support, and advocacy. Education, so like this series, it's really important for us not only to help survivors when they come into the RVSP office, or if they reach out through the telephone or on Teams now in this virtual world. It's so important that we're really doing education about consent, about the intersectionality of sexual violence and other forms of violence. And what I mean when I say intersectionality, it's a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and it essentially means we don't live single issue lives. They are all connected. So you can't end sexual violence and not take into consideration racial violence. They are all connected. All systems of oppression are connected. We all hold many different identities. That's like I spoke to earlier. Woman, white, heterosexual, cisgender, like those are all different identities. And the fact that they all combine themselves for one person impacts my life experiences. So it's important for education that we be talking about that so we can work towards a nonviolent culture on campus. The way that support looks is whenever someone reaches out to our office, again, I'm confidential, which is such a privilege. I'm very thankful to be, because if someone comes into my office or however I'm communicating with them, they have the power in the room. So it's not my job to give somebody advice. Whenever somebody reaches out, I'm going to make sure that they know about all of their options, all of their rights, so that they can decide what is their best path to moving forward. Is it making a Title IX report? Is it reporting to the police? Is it not reporting and just focusing on mental health? Is it they need academic accommodations because what they've gone through has made them not be able to get to class? Is it safety planning, emergency housing? I'm going to go over all of that with somebody, so again, that they can make whatever decisions best for them. And then advocacy. So advocacy really involves understanding that all forms of violence are connected and working towards creating policies within the university level, making sure to vote in local and national elections, and making sure that I'm supporting people in policies on behalf of survivors to really advocate for them to have access to their rights and to make sure that justice is upheld. And obviously justice in the criminal justice system does not happen a lot of times for survivors, but just making sure that we have policies that will support them in their path to moving forward. So I show this will be in every single one of my presentations, but I always show this spectrum of sexual violence to really highlight why are we giving a presentation on anti-racist basics. And what I love about this spectrum is that it shows that all forms of violence are rooted in oppression. And oppression is the combination of a group that has historically had power and the ability to discriminate against another group. So when we think about sexism, which is where gender-based violence is normalized, sexism is saying, okay, the group that has historically had power are men. And I'm going to speak pretty binary throughout this presentation, not because I don't recognize that all gender identities can be impacted by sexual violence, but just because I'm only have a certain amount of time. And when we look historically at who is the most impacted by gender-based violence, it is women. And that is because historically men have been in positions of power and women have been viewed, even historically as property. And so as women have gotten more rights, yes, gender-based violence maybe has decreased some or been more of a topic of conversation. We've started to really focus on other forms of sexual violence, relationship violence. But the research shows still on college campuses, 2 in 5 women or 3 in 5 women, depending on what research you're looking at, are victims of sexual violence, and 1 in 10 men. And I've seen up to 1 in 6 men on the research. But today I'm going to be really focusing on women being historically like the survivors and victims. So I do want to say that transparently, not to minimize that all gender identities and all individuals regardless of race, class, sexual identity, like every single individual can be impacted by sexual violence. And so I said, historically, men have had power. And if you think about race, historically, white people have had power. So when thinking about this discussion today, we are going to be thinking about the history and talking about how historically white men have been in the position of power. And so we cannot end sexual violence without ending all forms of violence. All of these isms of oppression are connected. So it would be pointless for us to be focused on working towards a world that was eliminated of sexual violence and not working towards a world that eliminates racial violence as well, or violence towards any person, like anyone with a disability, or violence towards anybody who identifies as a sexual minority. Like, we want to work towards a world that is free of violence. And that's bottom line. And that's advocacy, right? Advocacy is acknowledging I can't just advocate to end sexism or end misogynistic behaviors or stand up when someone tells a rape joke. It's like if I see someone using a racial slur, if I see someone having some form of aggression towards someone because of their race, like I need to speak up for that as well. And so now we're going to move into the history of racism within the anti-sexual violence movement. I think it's always important to acknowledge the history so that we can understand more of where we are at today. And so the history of sexual violence, deeply embedded in the history of the United States, which is founded on slavery and colonization. If you saw the presentation from last week we talked about processing defund the police. And one of the things that was super interesting to me when I was even working on creating that presentation was, really the police system, the criminal justice system, in a lot of ways is rooted in slavery and colonization. And when I'm giving presentations about rape culture, which is the culture that we live with that expects sexual violence to happen, that just says like, that's just the way it is. Rape culture is also deeply embedded in slavery and colonization. So when I saw those things intersect, it did open my eyes even more to how much racism and sexism intersect. And so when we think about slavery, and when we think about colonization, with colonization, rape was used as a weapon to definitely displace the indigenous population from their land. When we think about slavery, the rape of white women the rape of Black women by white men, white plantation owners, and even by other Black men, it was common and it was legal. So when white plantation owners raped Black women, there was no consequence. There was no repercussion. It was just accepted. And it is extremely devastating. And white men, obviously these plantation owners, they did have wives during this time. They had white women as their wives. And even these white women at that time would start to resent these Black women who have been raped because they might be jealous. They looked at it as, oh, my husband's having an affair. No, it's not an affair, it's rape. And the white men would justify this by saying, oh, well, no, this Black woman, she's super curvy, she's super promiscuous, she came onto me, I didn't have a choice, and that is where we got this Jezebel stereotype from, which you can see pictures of here on the right. And we started to see Black women being super hypersexualized, shown as being really promiscuous, really forward. And we still see those stereotypes exist today in our media for sure. And even when slaves were freed after the Civil War, when freed slaves started to have the chance to be even remotely liberated, or the chance to buy property, or the chance to potentially vote, and still that being very limited to who could potentially vote. We saw us move into the era of Reconstruction, which was about between 1865, 1877. And as Black individuals or people of color started to get some more freedom or right, as people were not enslaved anymore, what we saw, and it's so similar to relationship violence, at the time someone is leaving, the people in power or the abuser in power tries to exert more power and control, tries to do whatever they can to make sure that they can hold on to that power. So violence tends to escalate when someone's leaving an abusive relationship. And that's essentially what we saw, a huge parallel. That was what we saw in the Reconstruction period, is that enslaved people, Black people mainly, started to get more freedom. And as they did, they experienced more forms of violence. As they did, white men in particular started to become more organized in instilling fear in communities of color to really just try to keep power and control in America. And when they did this, Black people, these newly free individuals, it's not like they were trying to put white people down. They just want equality. They just want equal rights, that should be totally okay. But instead, white men completely feared that Black people would start to gain more power. They feared losing their labor force, and therefore we started to see more organized groups like the KKK, founded in 1866, who really just committed very heinous crimes. Lynching it already was popular in slave times, but then it was very organized. It was just happening all the time to keep communities of color in fear. And during this time is when we really started to see a lot of propaganda spread about stereotypes about Black men all being potential rapists, all being potential offenders, potential criminals. And so that idea was spread and the imagery was spread. And then what we saw for white women was the idea was spread that they were, all potential victims because they were all, like very just and just like good citizens of the world. And so we see these stereotypes happening. And again, we still see the ripple effects of this propaganda being spread in the 1800s. We still see the ripple effects today. And I should say, and I forgot to mention earlier, I did speak a little bit to the fear of losing the labor force during the Reconstruction period by white men. And I should say too, as when Black women were enslaved, and I say were very loosely, but when Black women were enslaved, they were also seen as the person who could give an ongoing labor force. So when white men were raping Black women, enslaved Black women, they also had a guaranteed source of labor, like from generation to generation. And so there really, really was during this Reconstruction period such a fear. Labor force is gone. Black individuals, people of color are starting to get more rights. So white people will not be in charge or in power anymore. And there was such a fear around that. And that was the reason why this propaganda spread. And during this time, it makes me like devastated to even say the rape laws that were made during this time said that the rape of a white woman by a Black man was a capital offense, but the rape of a Black woman was not even considered a crime. So you had white women being protected by the law, specifically against Black men, and you had Black women not being protected by the law at all. And so it was just like extremely devastating. So if a white woman came forward and said that she was raped by a Black man, or what we saw during this time was a lot of white men saying that Black man raped this white woman. And so a lot of lynchings were occurring, and this was the justification because they said, he's a predator, he's a predator, he's a predator, all being Black men. And so a lot of Black men experienced tons of lynchings around this, which was really sad. And it's also really important to acknowledge rape laws historically were founded in rape being a property crime. And I just want to speak to that as well. Rape was initially a property crime because women were seen as property, not as human beings. So it wasn't until later that that shifted, both Black and white women. And I think it's important to acknowledge that in the anti-rape movement, the people who really, really sparked the movement, who really used their voices, who spoke up were Black women. Black women have done so much for the anti-sexual violence movement and other forms of civil rights movements, but they spoke up, and the first women to really break the silence around rape were women who testified before Congress after the Memphis riot of 1866, when a white mob gang raped multiple Black women. And so they came forward and they used their voices to advocate against rape and to hold these people accountable. And I think it's just so important that we acknowledge the history so we can understand how we're seeing ripple effects today. And I just wanted to show the picture on the bottom right. I wanted to show too, because again, this is a more recent, I think it was from 2004. It's like these stereotypes still exist of, okay, like in this picture, you see the white woman have like a family and her baby, and this is the exact same product side by side. And then you see the Black woman with her kid, but like no Black father figure, no father figure at all. And it kind of just still perpetuates these stereotypes. Like, why did anybody think it was okay to put out this advertisement with people of different races, and a Black woman doesn't have the father figure there, but the white woman does? And so again, it's like the ripple effects of all these stereotypes from such a long time ago. And I wanted to acknowledge, so we kind of were just in the Reconstruction period. We were talking about like 1866 through the 1870s. And speaking about ripple effects of these rape laws, Emmett Till, and I always get like a little teary-eyed when I think of Emmett Till's story because it's just so, so devastating. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old Black boy who died in, I said died, who was murdered in 1955. He was visiting Mississippi, and this was like the era of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And so he was visiting, and during this time he went into a store that was owned by a white couple. And at the time, Carolyn Bryant was a white woman there. And she ended up saying that he tried to like catcall her, flirt with her. And when she went, and so that was considered a crime. And then when she went to testify, she ended up saying that he also made more verbal advances towards her and physical advances. And so after it got known that like, after she made any comment that he did anything at all to that in the store to her husband, Roy, and to his half brother, J.W. Milliam. I like to say their names because I think they need to be, like, their names should be known too as murderers. When she made the comments, when they found out that Emmett Till had maybe, possibly, potentially catcalled or flirted, which who knows what that actually looked like. It's still, there's still many descriptions. I mean, there's still not even known if any of it ever happened. But when they found out, they went to the home that he was visiting, that he was staying in Mississippi. They abducted him, kidnapped him, shot him in the head, lynched him, just like brutally murdered him, and threw him to the bottom of the local river. Well, his body was recovered, it was discovered, and it was sent back to his hometown in Chicago. And in Chicago, when they sent back Emmett Till in the casket, they had the casket closed. because they didn't want people to see how mutilated Emmett Till's body was. And even when I was finding a picture of Emmett Till to put on this presentation, I kind of keep having the images come up that I've also seen that are just so deeply disturbing. And when his body was sent back, his mom insisted on having an open casket funeral. And so tens of thousands of people ended up seeing how dismembered and how mutilated Emmett Till's body was. And it really caused a surge in the civil rights movement, just more people wanting justice, and just was that highlight of racism, especially racism in the intersection of sexual violence, being together, right? It's the intersection of those rape laws of it is, a capital offense for a Black man to rape a white woman, but then it's not even a crime for Black women to be raped, and I know that rape laws had slowly changed, but still it's that ripple effect and that sense of power. Like, that's again that propaganda of white men keeping the power by saying all Black men are potential rapists. And that is definitely not what occurred. And even years and years and years and years later, Carolyn Bryant came forward and said, I did fabricate things that I said at that time, that I said in my testimony. And it was just 1 year later. So in 1955, both Roy Bryant and J.W. Milliam, and I hope I'm pronouncing the names right, they both got acquitted for Emmett Till's murder. They had an all-white jury who all acquitted them. They had no consequences. And in 1956, they were protected under double jeopardy, that they could not be given any consequences for the murder of Emmett Till anymore. And they did come forward and say that they did it. So you had two white men get absolutely no consequence for murdering someone who was falsely accused of making sexual advances towards Carolyn Bryant. And so again, intersection, racism, sexual violence. And Emmett Till's story is completely, his life, the murder of Emmett Till is completely devastating, and something that always needs to be in our mind when we're thinking of the intersection of racism and sexism. And obviously this isn't the only person that this intersection ever collided and came to the result of a Black man being murdered or being held accountable to the death penalty. It's not, but it's one example, and we really need to be thinking about it. And getting more to the present. So, okay, we moved from like the 1860s, we moved from slavery to the 1860s to 1955. So it's like, okay, like let's keep moving forward. How are these ideas still present? I'm sure y'all are potentially familiar with, about 5 months ago, Amy Cooper was definitely in the headlines for being in Central Park. She was in Central Park and in an area, it's a bird watching area where dogs are supposed to be leashed. And a Black man asked her politely, can you leash your dog? And she was standing by a sign that said dogs should be leashed here. And her response was that she was going to call the police, and she did. She said that she was in fear, and she called the police and said an African American man, is, I forget what the last thing she said, but it was an African American man, is after me, is threatening me. He was very kindly asking her to leash her dog. She was asking him to turn off his phone, turn off the recording, saying that she was going to call police. And he just said, like, call them, because he wasn't doing anything wrong besides asking her to follow the rules. And after this happened, I mean, the video went completely viral, and she lost her job. She lost the dog. They took the dog back. Yeah, she lost her dog. She definitely experienced a lot of consequences. And the police made a charge against her for calling and making a false report, And her response was, I'm not racist. I didn't mean to harm that man in any way. I think I was just scared. And Ibram X. Kendi, who is the author of How to Be Anti-Racist, hugely known, like very well known in the anti-racist world, in anti-racist academics, his response was like, well, why was she saying that she's scared? Why did she fear a Black male? And the fact that she just feared him for existing in the same space as her, that in and of itself is racist. And fear is really harmful. When we look at Black men as all potential predators or people that put other people in fear, that is really harmful. And so when someone like that says, I'm not racist, that is why racism continues to exist in a lot of ways, because people deny the ripple effects of our history, the ripple effects of Black men being in the media as predators. And it's really, really problematic. And so I just wanted to share this example to share the ripple effects of even like those rape laws that we talked about earlier, the ripple effects of the propaganda being spread that Black men are all potential aggressors, or all potential perpetrators, or all potentially criminals. That is really, really problematic and constantly shown in media today still. And then from there, I want to shift into I kind of mentioned this earlier, even at the very beginning, of how much I owe, even being in the sexual violence movement, to women of color. And so two of those women of color who really were at the forefront of the anti-rape movement was Sojourner Truth and Ida B. Wells. So Sojourner Truth was the first woman, and she was a Black woman who was a former slave, who really connected the dots of sexism and racism with her speech, Ain't I a Woman, which was at the 1851 Women's Rights Convention. And during the speech, there were men that said, oh, women deserve to be treated really well. There were white men specifically, who were saying women this is the speech, they should basically be helped into carriages. Again, remember the time. They should be lifted over ditches and have the best place to stay. And so essentially saying like women all deserve chivalry. And what Sojourner Truth's response was to this is, okay, well, ain't I a woman? Nobody has ever done these things to me. So really, when you're saying women, you're only speaking to white women. You're not speaking to women of color. So her speech really connected, like, ain't I a woman? You're saying women deserve all these things, but we're only speaking to white women. So like, let's acknowledge that. But all women deserve these things. All women deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And she was just acknowledging, my history. I've worked just as hard as men. I've done just as many things. I gave birth to 13 children. Like, she's done so much and not been acknowledged for all the work that she's done, being a Black woman. But if she was a white woman, how would her life have been different? So she was one of the pioneers, and really at a national level being recognized to acknowledge that sexism and racism are connected, and that white women need to be speaking out and advocating for Black women and women of color as well. And then in the 1870s, Ida B. Wells, she really helped organize. Lynching was such a way to continue to terrorize Black men, Black communities, because again, white men would justify lynching Black men because they were all being seen as perpetrators. And so Ida B. Wells really started to organize anti-lynching groups, anti-rape groups that really worked towards, again, the anti-sexual violence movement. So these women were such pioneers in the movement, and often their voices still get overlooked today. So I wanted to take the time to acknowledge it. And then what we saw is, in terms of the anti-rape movement, so we talked about Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells. We saw the women in 1866 who testified before Congress being Black women. So we saw these women of color, really being the first voices in this movement. But then in the 1970s, we started to actually see rape crisis centers being established in a lot of different big cities. which is awesome, right? It was so great. We saw a lot of survivors starting to get involved and say, like, this is not okay. We need to be doing more to uh, end sexual violence in general. So more people were speaking out, more people were getting involved politically. And it was during this time that a lot more middle class white women started to get involved, and you started to see this friction between like white women getting involved and not giving any credit where it's due to women of color who had been working on this and acknowledging racism, so acknowledging that intersection for so long. And so uh, basically there kind of ended up being a little bit of a break off of like a lot of white women were getting the voice, getting the power, but leaving behind women of color, not speaking up or advocating for, hey, like, yes, we need to acknowledge sexual violence, but we also need to acknowledge racial violence still and the disparities there. And so, it was problematic in a lot of ways because white women just were speaking more for the white population and not acknowledging, like, but women of color, communities of color are experiencing sexual violence at disproportionate rates. So how do we bridge that gap? And I just put this picture here if anyone's interested. I watched this Mrs. America, was focused on the Equal Rights Amendment, and I thought it was interesting because when I look back on it, I'm like, mostly in that it's like a docu-series. It's just a series on Hulu. But a lot of white women are the main voices in that series too. And so you kind of see that women of color who have been the forefront of this movement for a long time start to kind of get a back seat when it's like they've been doing the work already, but then white men acknowledge white women's voices more as well. And so we kind of see still even the ripple effects of white women like taking credit for the work that Black women have already been doing. I think an example of this as well is that, the Me Too movement, of course, super, super popular. Harvey Weinstein, his cases, being held accountable, that was huge, 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 huge. But with the Me Too movement, it really went viral in 2017 in a lot of ways when Alyssa Milano made the tweet like hashtag Me Too in response to this tweet, if you can relate. And yeah, the Me Too movement went viral. And during that time, she made this quote in one of her interviews. It was the perfect storm to happen, and I feel really blessed I was the vessel, the messenger. It's very special and probably the greatest thing I've felt. Well, so she had quite a few interviews where she just took credit essentially for the Me Too movement and for it going viral. And that happened quite a few times. And what she failed to recognize in all of her interviews, which should be recognized in all of her interviews, was that she was not the founder of the Me Too movement. So the founder of the Me Too movement, Tarana Burke, the Me Too movement was actually founded in 2006. And Tarana Burke had already been a huge social activist. Like, this is her realm, her work. And she started the Me Too movement because she had a young girl come to her and essentially say, that she's experienced sexual abuse from a family member. And it was just devastating. And at that time, Tarana had pointed her in the direction of a coworker to really talk about it with. And she had mentioned, I really just wanted to say, me too. And that's when she really invented this now viral hashtag. And so I say that later, Alyssa did give credit where it was due. They had an interview together. So they've acknowledged it. She has acknowledged later that, yes, she was not the founder of the Me Too movement. But I think it's still really important to realize white women have historically been, part of the problem in not acknowledging how much work women of color have done to get us where we are today. And so it's just so, so important anytime that we're thinking about the sexual violence movement, again, to think about the intersection of racism and sexism, because they both go hand in hand. And the more that white women can start to give credit where it's due, the more that we can still bridge that gap in disparity. Okay, so like deep breath, I'm gonna take a sip of my soda. So we've talked about the history of the intersection of racism and sexism within the sexual violence movement, talked about the history of sexual violence, how it has disproportionately impacted women of color and the indigenous population. And so now, okay, we know racism exists, right? Bottom line, we know it exists. We know it has ripple effects today. And yeah, that's still very, very prevalent in our society. So now it's time to shift into, okay, what are some anti-racist basics? How do I continue to learn about this? So it's important that we start off by defining racism. And I got this definition from TASA. I was sitting in on TASA, which is the Texas Association Against Sexual Assaults conference this last year, which was focused on lifting everyone's voice, including marginalized populations. And they had some really, really great presentations. And one was called A Call to Our White Colleagues. So trying to call in white colleagues to understand how racism is involved in the sexual violence movement. And I thought this definition of racism was really good. You can find different definitions out there, but essentially it's the combination of prejudice and power. It's a system, a far-reaching system that functions independently from the intentions or self-images of individual actions. And what I think is so important about this quote, or sorry, not this quote, this definition, is thinking of racism as a system, right? It's systemic racism. We have systemic sexism. So racism is embedded in our legislation, in our policies, in our criminal justice system. If you had the chance to see Processing Defund the Police last week, we see racism so deeply embedded in these things. It's not just one individual saying one thing. It's not just one act. And I like this definition because essentially, you know, sometimes even from people that I know, what I'll hear is, well, wasn't that racist against that white person? Like if a person of color says something like a slur against a white person, or if a woman says something violent to a man, what I will hear is, well, isn't that racist? Isn't that sexist? And racism and sexism are not individual one-time things. They are systemic. They are far-reaching. So when people say those comments to me, it's like, no, that's not racism, right? People of color haven't historically had the power. So no, that it's not racist when a person of color says something to a white person, or it's not sexist when a woman says something to a man. Is it a violent use of language? Is it a violent action? Yeah, absolutely, potentially. I'm not trying to excuse any of that. When I say that it's not racist or sexist, I'm not saying it's not wrong. I'm not saying it's not violent, but I'm saying it's not systemic, right? It's one behavior. And when we are talking about racism and sexism, they are systemic. They are, again, deeply embedded into our policies, legislation, criminal justice system, healthcare system, housing system, right? So they are very far reaching versus like one behavior of a violent language or violent act toward another. And so it's important to acknowledge why white people have a hard time talking about race. And the reason that white people often have a hard time talking about race is because we learn racism, the predominant way that we learn racism is as an either or framework from such a young age. We hear that we are either not racist or we are racist. It's one or the other. There's no in between. And if you are racist, you are a bad person. If you're not racist, you're a good person. And when we say when you're racist, you're a bad person, it means like you're ignorant, bigoted, prejudiced, mean, old, and like a lot of people associate it with being Southern. If you're not racist and being a good person, you're progressive, educated, well-intentioned, open-minded, usually younger because you don't have as much biases rooted in you, and Northern because racism isn't as embedded in the North, but it definitely occurred there. And does still. Sorry, I said did, does. And so when we think about racism in this dichotomy, you're either racist or not. And when we don't think about it as a spectrum, this is very, very problematic. So a lot of times what happens with when people of color or even other white people try to hold another person accountable and they say, hey, that was really harmful, that was racist, or what you just said was racist. What white people hear is not that behavior was racist and I can do better. What white people a lot of times hear is that was racist, so you're calling me a bad person, and you say that you're saying that I've never done anything good in my life and you don't know me. I'm not a bad person. I'm a good person. If you only had a chance to know me, you would see all these great things that I've done, and how dare you? And so what we see is a lot of defensiveness, because when someone says that was racist or that is a racist statement, that is a harmful statement, what is being heard is this dichotomy of, okay, you're saying I'm not racist, so you're saying I'm automatically just a bad person as a whole. Like, you only see me as a bad person now. And that's why a lot of white people have such a hard time talking about race. But if we stopped thinking about racism as an either or, if we shift towards an anti-racist framework, then we can just say, hey, let's take out good and bad person. Let's take out you're either not racist and or racist. Let's take out this either or dichotomy. Let's just say you're racist, right? We live in a racist society. I said at the very beginning, we live and breathe racism every day because it's what our country is founded on. Even at the time of our Constitution, people of color, Black men were only considered 3/5 of a human, right? So we are founded on racism. And so if we just take out this, like, I'm either racist and I'm a terrible person, or I'm not racist and I'm a great person, if we take that out, acknowledge that human beings are complex individuals who are capable of being good or bad at any point, every single behavior, every single time that we speak, our language either contributes to a nonviolent culture or a violent culture. If we just say, I am racist, it's a matter of, am I really racist or am I less racist and working towards anti-racism? So if we take out that good bad dichotomy and just say, hey, I'm gonna live and breathe racism every day, so it's just a matter of what am I doing to be the least racist I can possibly be, that can take out some defensiveness. And it's really, really uncomfortable to realize how internalized racism is within you. It's super uncomfortable. I guess I can speak even for myself. Again, I really did not have many conversations about race until I was in grad school, which was like 3 years ago. And I didn't have conversations about race because I didn't have to. And the fact that I didn't have to shows that I had a choice in acknowledging race or not. And the fact that I have a choice in acknowledging how race plays a role in our culture, again, puts me in a position of white privilege, because I have a choice to have conversations about police. I have a choice to have conversations about how Black women experience healthcare, especially when they're trying to give birth, and how more Black women die from maternal issues because their pain isn't acknowledged. Like, I have a choice to acknowledge all of those things, and that is racism in and of itself, just playing a role in our society. So I wanted to show this clip. If y'all aren't familiar with Tomi Lahren, she she's on Fox News, I'm pretty sure now. She had a Facebook show called The Blaze. That's when this is from. This clip is actually from when President Trump won the election back in 2016. Yeah. And so it's her and Trevor Noah, who would be usually considered like left-leaning, liberal-leaning. She's usually considered conservative-leaning, Republican. So they have differing viewpoints, right? And so I wanted to just show this clip. I'm always thankful to see two people with polarizing viewpoints having conversations at least. Even if they don't get to an agreement, I think, being able to have a conversation is always really important. So I'm going to show it, and then after, kind of highlight some takeaways. This always happens. My clip works when I'm not in. Huh. Okay. This happened last time. I'm so disappointed because I did all these things to try and make sure it worked this time. But okay, so never mind. I will not be showing it. Hold on. So essentially, Trevor Noah has her on his show, and he is interviewing her. And at one point, she says, I don't see color. And his response is like, what do you do at a traffic light if you don't see color? Because there is nothing wrong with acknowledging color at all. And there's more to it that I was hoping to show, but it's not working. And so some of the key takeaways from that video, one of the things that she says is, I want people to understand that just because I criticize the Black Lives Matter movement, just because I criticize Colin Kaepernick taking a knee to the national anthem, she says, that does not mean I'm racist. And yeah, again, if we take out that dichotomy, if we just look at that spectrum of you're either less racist or more racist, that is on the side of more racist, right? We just take out the idea of people not being racist, right? Because nobody is immune to racism, because again, we live in a culture that was founded on racism. And when she says those things, she is like criticizing Colin Kaepernick for taking a knee to the national anthem, because she says she understands what that flag means to her and what it means to other people fighting for our country. And something that Trevor Noah points out is, when you talk about people who are fighting for our country, there are people of color who are fighting for our country too, that still do not have access to the same rights that white people fighting for our country do. So that flag means different things to different people, different rights to different people. And she is criticizing Colin Kaepernick taking a knee as well, because she says, like, that's just not the right way to protest. And one of Trevor Noah's questions as well is, well, what is the right way? And even lately, we have seen protests, we've seen nonviolent protests, we've seen protests that then have rioting and looting. And you see so many comments come out that say, this isn't the right way, this isn't the right way, this isn't the right way. And the reality is, white people are never going to say there's a right way for people of color to protest to get equal rights if white people are afraid of losing their power, right? And so I speak more about, when I say white people, I don't mean all white people. There's a lot of really great white allies, but anyone who is in fear of losing their own power, which historically white men, again, not all white men, but there are white men who are afraid of losing their power, of other people gaining equal rights. They're never gonna say there's a right way for other people to protest to get more equality, because they're afraid of losing power. That just goes back to all the way back to 1866. It's like, okay, well, There was never going to be a right way for newly free slaves to gain power that a white man saw, because they were afraid of losing their position of power. So then things can become more violent. And it's important to recognize the Black Lives Matter movement is about Black individuals having equal rights and having access to having, just equal resources, and not dying at the hands, being murdered at the hands of police. And so it's important to acknowledge, like, that is what they stand for, equality. And that's bottom line. And then when Tommy Lahren says, I don't see color, it's important to acknowledge that when we say we don't see color, when we act like we're colorblind, we are not acknowledging how someone's race impacts their life experiences. We are not acknowledging the history of that individual, of their intergenerational history, intergenerational trauma. We're not acknowledging any of that. And that is really invalidating and really harmful. So when we say we don't see color, that is just extremely harmful. And that falls in line with, if you say you don't see color, it also, that kind of moves from Black Lives Matter to all lives matter. And when people say Black Lives Matter, it does not mean that white lives don't matter. It doesn't mean that other lives don't matter. It means that, hey, Black lives have historically been marginalized, murdered at higher rates than white individuals, don't have access to equal health care, affordable housing nearly as much. So what are we doing to change this? What are we doing to actually show at a policy systemic level that Black lives matter? Let's create change. It is not saying we want to take rights away from white individuals. It's just saying we want equal rights. And so I really liked this quote. It's time we become comfortable with the uncomfortable conversations about race. I can't see because of my video. And then it really just talks about we need to be color brave, not color blind. Oh, instead of being colorblind, we need to be color brave, right? It's okay to acknowledge I'm white, you're Black, I'm white, you're an Indigenous individual. Like, it's okay to also ask people, like, hey, do you prefer to be called a Black woman, or do you prefer to be called an African-American woman? It's okay to have conversations and acknowledge, like, we can't just assume everyone, like, if we just say, I don't see color, like, it's like the elephant in the room. We are not the same color. We don't have the same life experiences. We don't have the same lens. We're not impacted by policies in the same way. It's okay to acknowledge all of that. When we don't, we're essentially just trying to, like, put this, like, shield on, or invisible veil on, of like, everyone's the same, everyone's treated equally. And it's just, that's just not true. And it's okay to acknowledge that. And I'll speak to, I even know, so growing up, even thinking about the conversations that we have about race so early, a lot of times if someone's in public with their child, and how children get super curious, they'll be like, why is that person Black and I'm white? Or why are they brown? Or why are they fat and I'm skinny? Children ask those questions at a young age, and they're not scared to ask those questions. It's only when the parent says, like, shh, like, don't call them Black, don't call them brown, don't call them fat. It's like when the parents come in and are like, oh, no. It's giving the message that you don't say that because one race is better than the other. You don't say that because one shape of the body is better than the other. It's like giving this idea in the child's head of, like, oh, I shouldn't call that person Black because that's a bad thing. And, like, what messages are we sending? So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I'm speaking, I guess, when I realize what I'm saying, I'm speaking more about, like, white parents talking to white children. And I'm gonna assume if my earlier video didn't work, this one's not either. Yeah, I will figure this out. But so this is a video of Robin DiAngelo, who wrote White Fragility, and Ibram X. Kendi. who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist. They're being interviewed by Gail King, and she's essentially just asking them, okay, like, well, what can you do? Do you think that there's a potential for racism to end within your lifetime? And both of their answers essentially are, I have hope for racism to end at a systemic level. Do I think it's going to happen in my lifetime? Probably not. But the advice that they're giving on what you can do now is really just educate yourself on anti-racism. So through reading, through finding articles, through watching videos, which I guess my videos aren't accessible, so like find your own videos. But so educate yourself. Don't think that the person to turn to is a person of color to answer all of your questions about racism. Turn towards people who actively are involved in anti-racist work. Turn towards videos, articles from people who have been doing this work. There's, with access to the internet, there's so much access to anti-racist resources. So turn towards those and don't put the burden on a person of color to be the one to educate you about anti-racism. Engage in tough conversations from a place of curiosity and love. It's really, really important that we talk about race, that we talk about, what I experienced as a white individual of not having to talk about the police versus what you experienced as a Black individual having to talk about the police at age 10 because there was a fear. It's important that we talk about how our race impacts our day-to-day when we're ready. And I say that too because I know a lot of times, like even the burden of education about anti-racism gets placed on people of color. And when that burden gets placed on them, it's like, especially with George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, with all the racial injustice that we've seen in the news, even in 2020, I mean, it's been occurring obviously for so long, but it's like people are already having to see their own Black community members get killed. So then when it's like, and it's their job to educate white people on anti-racism, no, right? If they need to take a break for themselves, that's completely normal, completely valid. And so that's where it's like everyone can engage in these conversations at a time that they have the mental capacity to do it and it's safe for them. If they're not in that place, that's completely okay. That's when we turn towards our phones, towards the internet, and educate ourselves. And then we also need to vote for people in positions of power who will work towards anti-racist policies. So obviously, we just had this recent national election. It's been a pretty big deal. But I encourage everyone to participate in local elections, in city elections, school, right? Like student government elections. And it's so important to have leaders of student organizations, leaders of campus-wide initiatives, leaders of faculty, of staff, who are going to really promote anti-racist policies and create a culture, whether it's a work environment, home environment, campus environment. We need people in positions of power who are going to create a nonviolent culture where racism is not tolerated and we are working towards being actively anti-racist. So that is kind of what you can do. That's like the message of hope. You can do something today. These are my sources. And then I put some resources, books to continue understanding anti-racism. There's a ton, right? There's tons of articles as well. There's lots of TED Talks. There's just so many great resources out there. If you Google anti-racist resources, you will find a ton. But definitely I want you to know if you ever have any questions, please don't hesitate to message me. I'd be happy to provide you a list. And then at the very end here, this is my contact information. So if you have any questions, if you have any feedback, if you're like, the way that came off sucked and I want to hold you accountable, that's all okay. So please know that you can contact me at any point in time, just with any questions, anything at all. I am here for you. And next Wednesday, I know it's Thanksgiving break, so a lot of people will probably just be home getting ready to eat turkey. But if you want to take a break, And join us for the How to Be a Decent Human Being series next week. What we're going to be talking about is breaking the bro code, which essentially will be focused on toxic masculinity within our culture and how do we work towards shifting that. So that will be next Wednesday at 3 p.m. So if y'all have any questions, let me know. And I will talk to you later. Have a good one. Thanks.